This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so, you're really diving deep this time, huh? The good neighbor policy.
Yeah.
We're talking excerpts from a whole history podcast, some pretty scholarly stuff. And you're not just, skimming the surface here. You really want to understand the controversies, the real impact, the whole picture of this whole policy.
It's an era that gets oversimplified, you know?
Yeah.
People hear good neighbors, and they just picture,
Yeah.
sunshine and handshakes.
Right.
But U.S. Latin American relations in the 30s and 40s,
Mm-hmm.
way more complicated than that.
Oh, yeah. Wait till we get to what happened with Mexico's oil industry.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Talk about a test of whether the U.S. was really being a good neighbor.
That's a perfect example. But
Yeah.
but first, I think we need to kind of set the scene.
Okay.
So the good neighbor policy, it promised a lot non-intervention respect for other countries' sovereignty,
Yeah.
economic cooperation, and it was a big shift from how the U.S. had been acting, in the decades before.
Right. Yeah, it's a move away from that whole Roosevelt Corollary thing, which basically said
Yeah.
the U.S. could just intervene in Latin America whenever it felt like it.
Yeah, the Roosevelt Corollary basically said the U.S. was the police power in Latin America, which obviously caused a lot of resentment.
Yeah.
So FDR wanted to change that, and I think the Montevideo Conference in 1933, that was kind of a turning point. That's where he made that big pledge of non-intervention.
At least on paper.
At least on paper, big symbolic moment.
Yeah, actions speak louder than words, right?
Exactly. Let's look at Haiti.
Okay.
They've been under U.S. military occupation since 1915.
Oh, wow.
Not exactly a friendly neighbor situation.
Right.
And then in 1934, U.S. troops pull out
Okay.
good neighbor policy in action, right?
Seems like it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, but here's the catch. The U.S. may have left militarily, but their financial influence was still very, very strong.
Oh, okay.
So did Haiti really gain true independence?
Right.
It's debatable. Some historians, like Emily Green Balch,
Okay.
she saw it as a real victory.
Right.
Respecting Haiti's right to govern itself.
Okay.
But others weren't so sure.
Yeah. What did they think?
The revisionist historians, they argue it was just a different type of control.
Okay.
Instead of soldiers, it was dollars and debt that kept Haiti tied to U.S. interests.
Okay.
Which raises the question, was the good neighbor policy truly about mutual benefit?
Yeah.
Or was it just a more subtle form of dominance?
Oh, okay. So good intentions, but maybe not always the best execution.
What about the Dominican Republic? I know they had a similar situation with U.S. occupation.
Right. And then Trujillo came to power.
Okay.
This is where the good neighbor policy kind of took a different approach.
Okay.
Instead of sending in the troops, the U.S. used diplomacy settled debts, tried to promote stability from afar.
Sounds reasonable.
Except Trujillo was a dictator, a brutal one.
And the question is, did the U.S. prop him up for their own benefit? This is where that realist school of thought comes in.
Okay.
They argue that even the seemingly good actions were serving U.S. interests,
Right.
even if it meant supporting some pretty bad guys.
So being a good neighbor sometimes meant turning a blind eye to some not so good behavior. That's pretty messed up.
It highlights those moral dilemmas of foreign policy.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Cuba. Another long and complicated relationship with the U.S.
Cuba and the U.S. Yeah, it's a story that goes way back.
Right. You can't talk about Cuba without talking about the Platt Amendment. This thing enacted in 1901
Okay.
basically gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba whenever they wanted.
Not exactly neighborly.
No.
Huh.
But in 1934, as part of the good neighbor policy,
Okay.
the Platt Amendment gets repealed.
Oh, wow.
A big step forward, acknowledged Cuban sovereignty,
Right.
improved relations between the two countries.
So win for the good neighbor policy.
Well, not so fast.
Yeah.
While the U.S. made this political concession, their economic influence, especially in the sugar industry, was still massive.
Right.
And then there's Guantanamo Bay, which remained under U.S. control.
Right. A lasting reminder of that power imbalance.
Right.
So it's kind of a mixed bag with Cuba.
Yeah.
Some genuine progress.
Yeah.
But also that shadow of U.S. dominance still looming.
Exactly. It shows the limitations of the good neighbor policy.
Right.
Influence can take many forms, not just military occupation. Let's shift gears to Panama.
Okay.
And that whole Panama Canal situation, always a touchy subject.
Oh, yeah, the canal. Talk about strategic importance.
Absolutely. The U.S. had controlled the Canal Zone for a long time, causing major tension with Panama.
Right.
But then in 1936 comes the Hull-Alfaro Treaty.
Didn't that give Panama more control?
It did. This treaty was huge symbolically.
Yeah.
It gave Panama more financial say over the canal and acknowledged their sovereignty over the Canal Zone.
Okay.
While not complete control, it showed a move towards respecting Panama's rights.
So not just a symbolic gesture, but also strategic on the U.S.'s part. I mean, war was looming in Europe. They needed that canal secure.
You're catching on. The good neighbor policy wasn't just about being nice.
Right.
It was also about securing U.S. interests
Right.
in a turbulent world. Which brings us to Mexico.
Okay.
And that oil situation you mentioned.
This is the one I've been waiting for.
1938.
Mexico decides to nationalize their oil industry. A lot of U.S. companies had invested heavily there, so this must have been a huge blow.
Huge is an understatement. There was immense pressure for the U.S. to step in.
Wow.
Militarily or economically. This was a direct challenge to U.S. economic power.
I bet FDR was getting an earful from all those oil barons.
Oh, yeah, he must have.
You had to do something, Mr. President.
But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of flexing U.S. muscle, FDR sticks to diplomacy.
Oh, wow.
It took a few years, but eventually they reached a settlement. U.S. companies got compensated,
Okay.
but Mexico kept control of their oil.
Wow. That's kind of amazing. Considering the pressure he was under, that must have taken some serious guts on FDR's part.
Yeah.
It really shows he was committed to this whole good neighbor thing.
Yeah.
Even when it was tough.
It solidified the idea that the good neighbor policy wasn't just talk.
Right.
It was a gamble.
Yeah.
But it paid off. It showed a level of respect for Mexico's sovereignty that was pretty rare at the time.
Okay, so the U.S. wasn't always a perfect neighbor, but they were trying, at least in some cases.
Yeah.
What about in situations where the U.S. wasn't directly involved, like in a conflict between other Latin American countries?
Good point. A perfect example is the Chaco War.
Okay.
A brutal fight between Bolivia and Paraguay in the 1930s.
Right.
Now, in the past, the U.S. might have jumped in, taken sides,
Uh-huh.
maybe even tried to impose their own solution.
Classic U.S. interventionism.
Exactly. But with the good neighbor policy in place, things were different.
Okay.
Instead of playing the big power, the U.S. took a back seat, supported League of Nations mediation efforts,
Interesting.
stayed neutral,
Okay.
encouraged a peaceful resolution.
So instead of throwing their weight around, they actually promoted regional cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty unique for the time.
It was. And it shows a key aspect of the good neighbor policy.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about bilateral relationships between the U.S. and individual countries,
Right.
but also about fostering stability and peace in the entire region.
Okay, so we're starting to see, like, the different sides of this good neighbor policy. Good intentions,
Yeah.
sometimes questionable actions, strategic motives, but also some real progress and a genuine effort to change the old patterns of U.S. dominance.
But how do historians interpret all of this?
Right.
Isn't there a lot of debate about the true meaning and impact of the good neighbor policy?
You're right. There are a lot of different perspectives on the good neighbor policy.
Yeah.
Some historians see it as a genuine attempt to improve relations,
Right.
while others see it as a more subtle form of U.S. imperialism.
It all depends on how you look at it.
Right.
So let's unpack some of these historical interpretations.
Okay, so break it down for me.
Yeah.
What are the main schools of thought
Yeah.
on the good neighbor policy? I'm ready to get my history nerd on.
Okay. All right, let's dive into those different historical takes. One group, you got the realists.
Okay.
They argue that the good neighbor policy, it was mainly about self-interest.
So basically, the U.S. was being nice because it benefited them, especially with a possible war on the horizon.
Exactly. Realists, like historian William Appleman Williams, they say the U.S. wanted to secure their backyard, make sure Latin America was on their side, and also protect their economic interests in the region.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But didn't some historians think it was a little more sinister than that?
Right. You have the revisionists. They're a little more critical.
Okay.
They argue that even though the U.S. wasn't sending in troops as often,
Right.
they were still pulling the strings just in a different way.
So instead of outright military force, it was more about economic control,
Yeah.
political pressure, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Think about the U.S.'s dominance in industries like oil and sugar.
Right.
Revisionist historians argue that the good neighbor policy was more about maintaining U.S. power
Okay.
than promoting true equality.
Kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Mm-hmm.
Friendly on the surface,
Yeah,
but still calling the shots.
that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Now, on the flip side, you've got the diplomatic school.
Okay.
They focus on the positive aspects of the policy, the genuine efforts to improve relations through diplomacy and cultural exchange.
So more emphasis on cooperation and communication.
Yeah.
Trying to build bridges instead of burning them.
Right. They point to things like the Pan American Conferences, where the U.S. and Latin American countries came together to discuss issues and work towards common goals.
It sounds like they see the good neighbor policy as a more idealistic endeavor, a genuine attempt at building a better relationship.
Exactly. They argue that figures like FDR truly believed in fostering better understanding and collaboration between the Americas. But then you've got another group, the humanitarian school.
Okay, what's their take?
They highlight the peaceful aspects of the policy.
Okay.
Things like the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
Right.
They see this as a sign that the U.S. was trying to move away from its interventionist past.
So they focus on the positive impacts.
Yeah.
The move towards peace and cooperation, the effort to respect the sovereignty of other nations.
Yes. They see the good neighbor policy as a step in the right direction.
How?
Even if it wasn't perfect. They might argue that FDR was truly committed to peace and wanted to create a more just world order.
Wow, so many different perspectives. It's like looking at the same painting from different angles. Each viewpoint reveals something new and important.
That's a great way to put it. And it's crucial to consider all these angles.
Right.
To get a complete picture of the good neighbor policy. It wasn't all good or all bad. It was complicated.
Yeah.
Just like any historical event.
Speaking of complicated, I think it's easy to forget that the good neighbor policy wasn't just some abstract idea being debated in Washington. It played out in real people's lives in countries across Latin America. I'm curious to hear more about how those on the receiving end of this policy, how they felt about it.
That's a really important point. We can't just focus on the U.S. side of the story.
Right.
We need to understand how Latin American governments and people viewed and experienced the good neighbor policy.
Right. It's their perspective that really matters in the end.
Exactly.
Right.
So let's look at some specific examples. Let's start with Mexico.
Okay.
We talked about the oil nationalization in 1938. That must have been a major turning point in U.S.-Mexico relations.
Yeah, it was a bold move by Mexico, taking control of their own resources.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine the U.S. was too happy about it.
You're right. A lot of powerful people in the U.S. were furious.
They saw it as a direct attack on their economic interests.
Right.
But as we discussed, FDR chose diplomacy over intervention, which was a huge win for the good neighbor policy.
It was a gamble that paid off. But I'm curious, how did the Mexican people feel about all this?
For many Mexicans, the nationalization of the oil industry, it was a moment of national pride. A symbol of their independence and sovereignty. They had been exploited by foreign companies for decades, and they were finally taking back control.
So it wasn't just about the oil itself, but about what it represented, their right to self-determination.
Exactly. And FDR's decision to respect their choice, even under pressure, was a huge validation of the good neighbor policy.
Wow.
It showed that the U.S. was finally treating them as equals.
It's like actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
You can say you're a good neighbor, but when you actually respect another country's right to make its own choices, that's when it becomes real. I totally agree. Of course, not everyone in Mexico was thrilled about the nationalization. Some worried about the economic consequences or about damaging their relationship with the U.S. But overall, it was seen as a victory, a moment that helped define Mexico's identity on the world stage.
That's so interesting. It really brings it to life. Seeing it from their perspective makes you realize that history isn't just about dates and events, but about real people and their lived experiences.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that every story has multiple sides. So let's look at another example. What about Brazil?
Okay.
They were a major power in South America at the time.
Yeah, Brazil. I know they were led by Getulio Vargas. A pretty controversial figure. Wasn't he a dictator?
He was a complex and authoritarian leader who ruled for almost 2 decades.
Wow.
But he was also a shrewd politician who saw the good neighbor policy as an opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
For Brazil to gain power and influence. Both economically and politically, Vargas was eager to secure U.S. investment and support, and he was willing to align Brazil with the U.S. to achieve his goals.
So he played the game, so to speak. using the good neighbor policy to his advantage.
Exactly. And to some extent, he was successful.
Okay.
Brazil became a key U.S. ally during World War II and benefited from U.S. aid.
Right.
But there were also costs. Vargas's authoritarian rule,
Right.
his human rights abuses were largely ignored by the U.S. because he was a valuable ally.
So in a way, the good neighbor policy could be used to prop up dictators, as long as they were on the U.S.'s side.
That's one of the criticisms that's been leveled against it.
Right.
It highlights the moral compromises that sometimes come with foreign policy.
It's like that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
Even if that friend isn't exactly a saint.
Exactly. It shows how national interest can sometimes trump ideals.
Yeah.
But looking at Mexico and Brazil,
Yeah.
it's clear that the good neighbor policy wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It played out differently in different countries depending on the specific context and the leaders involved.
Right. It wasn't just a simple formula.
Yeah.
It was a dynamic process
Yeah.
with both positive and negative consequences.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that the good neighbor policy wasn't some isolated event.
Right.
It was part of a larger historical context, a world in turmoil with the rise of fascism,
Right.
the Great Depression, and the looming threat of World War II.
All these factors shaped how the policy was conceived, implemented, and ultimately how it played out.
Exactly. And understanding that context is crucial for understanding the good neighbor policy and its legacy.
Okay.
Speaking of legacy,
Yeah.
I think it's important to consider how this period continues to shape U.S. Latin American relations today.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It might seem like ancient history, but I bet there are still echoes of the good neighbor policy
Oh, yeah.
in the way the U.S. interacts with Latin America today.
Absolutely. The good neighbor policy might have officially ended with World War II,
Right.
but its influence can still be felt
Uh-huh.
in the political, economic, and cultural ties between the U.S. and Latin America.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me some examples.
Yeah.
How does the ghost of the good neighbor policy still haunt us today?
Well, I think one of the biggest legacies is this idea of the U.S. as like the dominant power in the region.
Right. Even though the good neighbor policy was supposed to be about moving away from
Exactly.
that old interventionist approach.
But, you know, those patterns of influence are hard to break.
Right.
You can't just erase decades of history overnight.
So even if the U.S. is trying to be more cooperative and respectful,
Yeah.
there's still this underlying power dynamic that's hard to ignore.
It's like there's this historical baggage that comes along with like
Oh, yeah.
every interaction.
And I bet that makes it hard for Latin American countries to fully trust the U.S.'s motives.
Absolutely. There's always that suspicion that the U.S. is acting in its own self-interest, even when they're talking about, you know, partnership and collaboration.
It's like that saying, once bitten, twice shy.
Exactly. But on the flip side, the good neighbor policy did create some positive precedents.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it emphasized diplomacy and multilateralism,
Right.
which are still important principles in U.S. Latin American relations today.
So instead of just dictating policy from Washington,
Right.
the U.S. is more willing to work with regional organizations and listen to the perspectives of other countries.
Right. There's a greater emphasis on, you know, finding common ground and building consensus.
And hopefully that leads to more sustainable and mutually beneficial partnerships.
That's the idea. And the good neighbor policy also showed the power of cultural exchange.
Right. All those programs promoting travel education, artistic collaborations.
Exactly. And those kinds of connections, they can really help to build bridges and foster understanding between people.
It's like food, music, and art.
Mm-hmm.
They can kind of transcend political differences and create a sense of shared humanity.
I love that analogy. So even though the good neighbor policy had its flaws, it did plant some seeds that have continued to grow.
It's like a complicated garden with both beautiful flowers and some thorny weeds.
I like that. It's a reminder that history is full of contradictions and unintended consequences.
And it's up to us to learn from the past, both the successes and the mistakes.
So true. Knowing all this, what do you think is the most important lesson for our listener who's been digging into this topic?
That's a tough one. I think it's to understand that the good neighbor policy wasn't like a simple solution or a magic bullet. It was a complex and evolving process with a mixed legacy.
I agree. It's not a story with a clear-cut happy ending.
But it's a story that's still being written.
Exactly. And by understanding the complexities of the past, we can be more informed and engaged citizens in the present.
We can ask critical questions, challenge assumptions, and work towards a more just and equitable future for everyone involved.
Beautifully said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Well, folks, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Good Neighbor policy.
It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating and often overlooked chapter of history with you.
And we hope you've gained some new insights and perspectives along the way.
Remember, history is not just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
So keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the complexities of the world around you.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.